In 1953, an almost blind and crippled old man sat in a cinema in Germany to watch newsreel footage of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation.
And as he places it upon the Queen's head and removes his hands, the assemblage in one voice cries, "God save the Queen."
But for an extraordinary twist of fate, that man, a British prince, born in England and Queen Victoria's youngest grandson, would have played his part at the ceremony. Instead, he had been branded a traitor peer and was a convicted Nazi who had helped Hitler's rise to power.
My great-grandfather was a casualty of the royal system. If someone had been able to stand up to Queen Victoria, his life would have been very different.
Prince Charles Edward was a close blood relation to the newly crowned Queen and first cousin to her grandfather, George V. The story of his journey from the heart of the British royal family to Hitler's inner circle has been carefully guarded by a royal family keen to erase it from their history. For the most damning fact of all was his association with the Nazi extermination program for the disabled and mentally ill.
Well, he's only a footnote in history, but I think he was a big Nazi who got away with it.
In fact, the full account of his life has never been told in its entirety, until now. How did a British prince end up as one of Hitler's staunchest allies? The story begins in Victorian England. On the 19th of July, 1884, Prince Leopold Charles Edward, 2nd Duke of Albany, Earl of Clarence and Baron Arklow, was born at Claremont House, Esher, Surrey. He was part of the most powerful royal family in the world. His first cousins were King George V, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Tsar Nicholas II, men who would shape 20th century Europe.
Charles Edward was born at a time when monarchy was the unchallenged form of government from Lisbon to Vladivostok. What was always seen to be the great golden era of European monarchy.
But Charles Edward's birth was marred by tragedy. Just 3 months earlier, his haemophiliac father, Prince Leopold, died after falling down some stairs.
The fact of his father dying while he was still in the womb made a tremendous difference. This child is doubly precious because its father has died. There won't be any more. So you would expect little clouds of tension round him. He's said to have been a nervous baby.
The death of Charles Edward's father, Leopold, was a terrible blow to Queen Victoria. He was her favourite, the one most like her beloved Prince Albert, the grandfather Charles Edward would never know. After Leopold's death, the great matriarch transferred her care and affection to his family, Charles Edward, his elder sister Alice, and their mother, the Duchess of Albany.
Queen Victoria, his grandmother, was a great supporter of the Duchess of Albany and very, very fond of her, and she kept a very watchful eye, I think, constantly on the Albany family, and was very supportive of the Duchess in bringing up basically 2 children on her own.
Despite these circumstances, Charles Edward had an idyllic childhood. From the moment he was born, his older sister Alice was his best friend and greatest protector. They were so close that their family nickname was the Siamese Twins.
He was a very happy little boy. He loved his home, he loved England, he loved his mother, and he loved his sister.
Their world revolved around Claremont and Windsor Castle, where Grandmother Queen Victoria lived.
They would arrive at Windsor and they would be escorted by these whispering attendants down endless corridors till they reached the kind of inner sanctum of Queen Victoria's apartments. And then at the door, before the door was opened, the nurse would say, mind you curtsy at the door, mind you kiss Grandmama's hand, mind that you're not too noisy and behave yourself and mind you're clean. And the door would open And in they would walk, and they'd be faced by this tiny little woman, all dressed in black.
Aunt Alice talked about Queen Victoria, and she was really fun to have as a grandmother. She loved telling little jokes and having fun with the children and grandchildren. And always was smiling.
In those days, we respected our elders, so we had great respect for her. She was wonderful. She was awfully nice. When we lost our first teeth, she always used to give us £1. So we were terribly pleased. One time, I hadn't seen her for some time. I lost 3, and I brought these 3 to show us. And she said, "Oh dear, that's very expensive."
Charles Edward and Alice's world of privilege came with royal pressures and responsibilities. From birth, their mother instilled in them that above everything, their duty to Queen and country always came first. But what came naturally to Alice was more difficult for her younger brother.
I think Charlie felt sometimes rather intimidated by his mother, that her demands and her expectations were too high, and his sister certainly felt that it had led Charles to hide things from his mother. It led him to evade independent decisions as he got older.
In 1897, aged 13, Charles Edward took part in his first major royal event.
So when Victoria, the widow of Windsor, rode past in her carriage and celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, the whole world, friend and foe, lifted its cap.
But for Charles Edward, performing royal duties was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. While riding in a carriage with his cousin, Prince Arthur of Connaught, nerves overcame him in a very public and embarrassing way.
And of course they forgot breakfast time, they forgot to be ready. They were rushed down and put into their kilts. Only just time to start, and had no breakfast. And my brother was sick on the route too. It was terrible to do. I'm so glad I wasn't in the carriage with him.
As a minor British prince, Charles Edward was destined for a largely uneventful life in a royal world that seemed assured and unchanging.
Everything is like a sort of great European house party. It's all sort of, the yacht at Cowes and sea bathing at Corfu, and life as a sort of late Victorian idyll. The sun always shines, there's always honey for tea. Everything is in its place, everything is secure, everything is stable. Grandmama Queen at Windsor has been reigning for as long as anybody can remember, and it's all fantastic, and it'll all go on forever.
But for Charles Edward, the idyll would end abruptly. A decision made by his grandmother, Queen Victoria, would put him in the wrong place at the wrong time, sending his life in a direction that she could never have foreseen. Queen Victoria's youngest grandson, Prince Charles Edward, 2nd Duke of Albany, would one day inherit Claremont House and could look forward to a life of royal service. But now he was a carefree 14-year-old Eton schoolboy. His mother's most pressing concern was that he understood his royal duties and responsibilities and lived up to the memory of his father. In a letter, she wrote, "Charlie, please remember what I tell you. Don't forget work and duty over your pleasures. Don't be lazy and indolent. If my words read hard, understand that they come out of a very full heart, full of love and anxiety, to help you become a good man, so that you bring no shame on Papa's name." But shame was to be his legacy. The reason lay hundreds of miles from Eton, in a chocolate-box German town called Coburg. It was not part of Queen Victoria's worldwide empire, but it held a very special place in her heart. And in 1899, events there became of huge concern.
Coburg was always seen to be significant to Queen Victoria because it was where her husband, Prince Albert, came from. Although it was geographically a tiny little town, it was seen to be very important for Victoria for emotional reasons, but also it was, in some senses, the centre of the dynasty.
It was also the centre of her world. For Queen Victoria, Coburg was more than just a town in Germany. It was part of her surname, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and absolutely central to her identity. Coburg was known as the stud farm of Europe, and with good reason. Nearly all the crowned heads, including Queen Victoria herself, were either descended from or married to Coburg princes and princesses. When the reigning Duke of Coburg died, leaving no legitimate heirs, a succession crisis loomed. She was determined to keep control of Coburg within her direct family, and decreed that one of her sons or grandsons should become the next duke.
The next in line was Arthur, Duke of Connaught, who was very much known as an English soldier and very much a favourite son of Queen Victoria.
But the Duke of Connaught definitely didn't want to go to Coburg. He wanted to stay in Britain.
There was a little bit of toing and froing with the Duke of Connaught and his son, also Prince Arthur of Connaught.
But Prince Arthur was no more keen than his father.
The next in line was the unfortunate Charles Edward.
So the story goes that Prince Arthur of Connaught sought out his cousin Charles Edward because they were both at Eton together and said to him, if you don't put yourself forward as a candidate for the Coburg inheritance, I'm going to give you a thrashing.
The New York Times gleefully reported,
his head was not punched. Cousin threatened to whip him.
Queen Victoria was adamant Charles Edward should go. His mother was adamant that he should stay.
The Duchess did try to stop Queen Victoria. She explained that he has a duty to look after his estate. And the Queen said, no, your duty is to the Queen. He has to go.
Queen Victoria believed it was her absolute right to make life-changing decisions on behalf of her children and grandchildren. Charles Edward was left with no choice.
He didn't know anything about Germany. And so suddenly to be sent there as a young boy, he loved his school. He couldn't even speak the language. He certainly would have said no. He didn't want to go.
Queen Victoria forced Charles Edward to take the title, and with it came great wealth and huge responsibility. 13 castles in Germany and Austria, hunting lodges, hotels, a power station, plus tens of thousands of hectares of farmland and forest in Bavaria. The annual income of the duchy was worth the equivalent of £17 million today. All this now belonged to her 14-year-old grandson, and he didn't want any of it.
Well, I went on a trip to Germany when I was about between 16 and 18. I just saw this enormous building right on top of the hill. I thought at the time what my great-grandfather must have thought as a young boy being taken away from England and placed in this position. And it must have been both awe-inspiring and absolutely terrifying for him.
The Germany that was Charles Edward's new home was bombastic and militaristic, a far cry from his life in England. He was now under the watchful eye of his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, who enrolled him at the Lichterfeld Military Cadet School, the German equivalent of Sandhurst.
It was a training ground for Prussian officers, and it was a very, very hard regimen, very different than Eton. The cadets would rise very early, 5 o'clock in the morning. They would take cold showers. They would be marching around the parade ground, very strict discipline. They were trained to become leaders, but hard military officers. And for this sensitive English young man to be thrown into this situation, I can imagine it was very, very traumatic.
In 1900, age 16, Charles Edward, Duke of Albany, became Karl Eduard, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His transformation from English schoolboy to German aristocrat was complete. Just 6 months later, his grandmother, Queen Victoria, died. His first official engagement as Duke of Coburg was to attend the funeral of the very person who ordered him there.
To be the head of the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family was a very important, significant position. He was near or at the top of European royalty, and certainly one could expect that he would marry into the best families.
But even in this, he was not allowed to choose his own bride. It was the Kaiser who picked out the perfect German princess for him, his niece, Victoria Adelheid.
After a ball, he was told he had to go in the room where the young lady was, and he had to ask if she would marry him. And that was the girl. And it was a great success.
Coburg has always loved her because they said she's one of us. This guy might be English, but at least his wife is a reliable German.
The arranged marriage was a happy one, but his most treasured relationship remained with his Siamese twin and beloved sister, Alice. She was now also married. Her husband, Prince Alexander of Teck, was Queen Mary's brother, and Alice was now at the heart of the royal family. Hundreds of miles away, her brother was dutifully doing as he was told and turning himself into the perfect German duke.
He put the finances of the duchy in order, he put the finances of the dynasty in order. He was very interested in things like the theatre, and he's very interested in the architecture and the history of lots of the residences which he inherited. And he put those into good order as well. And I think he was seen by the people of the duchies as a very competent and hard-working chap.
Charles Edward made the best of his new German life, and by 1912 had 4 children: Ernst, Sibylla, Hubertus and Caroline. But his dual nationality and tumultuous political events were about to place him in an impossible position.
Basically, Britain and Germany were economic and political rivals. That fueled the conflict, not the interpersonal or family relations between the Kaiser and the Tsar, or between King George V and the Kaiser. That Europe really had died 20-odd years ago.
Once again, Charles Edward's destiny was to be determined by a more powerful relation. The Kaiser's lust for power would directly destroy his English-born cousin's family bonds and ties in Britain. In June 1914, Charles Edward had returned to Windsor Castle to see his mother and sister Alice, when news came through of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That event would trigger the First World War and put Charles Edward in an agonizing position.
It is 1914. War has been declared. All over the world, men pledge themselves to fight to their dying breath. And now they march to the field of glory.
When war broke out, there was certainly a great deal of hostility to the English-born Duke. He faced hostility here as a traitor, but also hostility in Germany because he wasn't German-born.
Yet again, Charles Edward was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this time the Kaiser expected him to do his duty. He had no other option than to fight for his adopted homeland, but he was adamant he would not face British troops. He was posted to the Eastern Front, where he faced the Russian army in Prussia and Poland. Because of his royal status, Charles Edward was made Colonel-in-Chief of the 95th Infantry and a general in the Saxon cavalry. Total allegiance to the Kaiser was what was expected of him, but his personal loyalties lay elsewhere.
Obviously, Charles Edward and his sister Alice worked on different sides during the war. But I don't think in the end it affected them as brother and sister. I think that the family connection for both of them was strong enough, and was seen as strong enough, that there was, in a sense, family loyalty and there was national loyalty.
In Britain, anti-German feeling reached fever pitch, and the royal family became its focus. Their surname, the unmistakably German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was turning the country against them. George V distanced himself from his German roots and relations and changed his family name to Windsor. Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was effectively being written out of his own family's history.
And at the same time, other members of the family were translated and rebranded into Englishmen. Battenberg became Mountbatten, and the House of Teck, from which Queen Mary came, and they all became Cambridges and Athlones. It was a very clever thing to do, but it wasn't necessary to do it to get rid of everything German and become much more identified as British.
By November 1918, when the First World War ended, more than 8 million were dead, and the map of Europe had changed forever. Gone were the huge European empires and the royal dynasties who ruled them.
Millions of people had died, and those that were left said, well, what is the point in royal Europe, in having this Europe of families, if they're not able to prevent appalling conflicts? And that, I thought, really was the death knell, if you like, of dynastic royal Europe.
The winds of change were sweeping across Europe. The 1917 Russian Revolution lit a communist spark that now took hold in a beaten Germany. Angry Germans and returning troops formed powerful socialist soldiers and workers' councils and began to revolt. Charles Edward was one of their targets.
He takes it very, very personally. He had thought of himself as a populist, as a leader who really cared for his population, and to see these workers rise up against him, to come to the gates of his castles and physically try and sort of overthrow him and to break down the doors and almost carry him out. Again, very, very traumatic for him.
Charles Edward was allowed to keep his castles, but stripped of his titles and political power. The Kaiser abdicated, Germany became a republic, and all former princes became ordinary citizens.
Some of them, I think, decided that they would simply be landowners, that they would accept the days of monarchy were over. I think for Charles Edward, that was a very difficult thing to do. I mean, he had given up a lot. He'd come from Britain, he'd become a good German, he'd seen a country which he was now very proud of, Germany, defeated. He wasn't a person who would simply stand on one side.
Stripped of his German titles, worse was to come. In Britain, along with 3 other German princes, Charles Edward was branded a traitor peer by an Act of Parliament and stripped of his British titles and royal status.
This is the Titles Deprivation Act. Their lordships do humbly report to your majesty that the persons hereinafter named adhered to your majesty's enemies during the present war. His Royal Highness Leopold Charles, Duke of Albany, Earl of Clarence and Baron Arklow.
I've seen photographs when he was a little boy where he signs his name Albany. That was who he was. And to have that taken away and told you're our enemy, that must have been a huge blow to his self-esteem, because it's like somebody taking away your identity.
While Charles Edward's place within the royal family was taken from him, his sister Princess Alice was the living embodiment of the life he would have led had he stayed in Britain. She was becoming a firm favourite with the British public. And for Charles Edward, it was painfully clear their lives could only lead in very different directions.
I have the very greatest pleasure in declaring this building open.
Carl Edward says in one of his letters to his sister, we remember in 1914 when we saw each other for the last time, war broke out, ending our happiness.
Charles Edward was a lost soul. In Britain and Germany, everything he had ever been born with, believed in, or taught to value had been taken from him. Disillusioned and depressed, the life he knew had disappeared forever. But a beguiling saviour would soon emerge: Adolf Hitler. By 1922, Charles Edward had lost everything he valued. He had been stripped of his British and German titles, been branded a traitor peer, and was no longer welcome at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Germany was in crisis, and fear of communism taking hold there was uppermost in Charles Edward's mind.
Russia is the key. If you want to understand why he turned so right-wing, you have to understand that he was terribly scared of this red threat.
The bloody 1917 Russian Revolution had shaken Charles Edward to the core. His cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, had been murdered with his family by the Bolsheviks. In Germany, a socialist uprising had robbed him of his titles and land. Chaos reigned, and for Charles Edward, the answer lay in extreme right-wing politics.
They were very much radicalized. The German aristocracy after the First World War had lost so much in status and money and power, so they turned to movements they wouldn't have looked at before.
Before the war, he's a kinder, gentler sort of leader. And you can see the lot he throws himself in with after the war. They're a very nasty group of people, and he becomes complicit in some very violent, some very troublesome activities.
Germany was awash with right-wing parties vying for power. One of the smallest but fastest growing was led by the charismatic former army corporal Adolf Hitler.
These right-wing organizations often resorted to murder, political murders, and between 1918 and 1922, it's killed over 370 politicians. These were the people with whom Charles Edward was associating.
For Charles Edward, the right wing offered a return to order and strength, but at a price. Beneath the surface was lawlessness and menace. He knew he was in dangerous territory.
He writes to his sister, and you probably won't agree with my involvement in this group. So he knows that she thinks it's absolute madness.
His right-wing militancy stood against everything Princess Alice believed in. While he was unwelcome in England, she could go to Germany, and in 1922 took their elderly mother to visit him. It was a bittersweet reunion. Only days after arriving, their mother died suddenly.
He was in a very emotional state of mind as he returned to Coburg. We can speculate psychologically, perhaps he felt somewhat liberated that his mother, that this English princess was now gone, and that he was now truly his own man.
But not for long. 3 weeks after his mother's death, Hitler came to Coburg for the first time. Until 1922, German National Day had been a peaceful event where rival left and right-wing political parties held their rallies. This year, Hitler hijacked it. He stormed into town with 800 brown shirts, outmuscled his left-wing opponents, and claimed the day as his own. Charles Edward had found the strong leader he had been looking for.
Charles Edward greeted Hitler and all the Congress participants and made a speech where he said that he supported their project, which was to overthrow the Weimar Republic. But then Hitler and Charles Edward proceeded to take a walk up into the castle and along the walls. And all of the participants were watching the body language as Charles Edward was showing him the beautiful landscape, and then they shook hands. It was clear that he was supporting Adolf Hitler. It was an extraordinary act, bold, even reckless. This made Charles Edward the first prince in all of Germany to support the National Socialists.
Hitler, of course, promised, like every politician, everything to everyone. And what he promised to the aristocracy was that they would now get back their jobs in the military, they could have influence again on a political level, and especially the higher aristocracy could play a great part as diplomats. Karl Eduard says in one of his letters to Alice, "It's so wonderful that one is still needed these days." He felt really wanted for the first time after 1918. Somebody needed him.
By giving Hitler his aristocratic seal of approval, Charles Edward elevated him above the other right-wing leaders and was instrumental in helping his rise to power. Coburg became synonymous with the history of the Nazi Party. Not only had Hitler established himself as the principal right-wing leader there, but it also became the first town in Germany to elect a Nazi mayor. But Charles Edward's wife, Victoria Adelheid, didn't share Coburg's or her husband's enthusiasm for the Nazis.
She didn't join the party. She never wanted to be in the party. She was frightened of anything to do with the party, and so she was always worried about him.
In early 1933, Hitler achieved his goal and was elected Chancellor of Germany. He created a new image for the country as a vibrant, modern nation driven by science and technology. Charles Edward was enthralled and had a brainwave. He would show the world the glamour and excitement of the new Germany.
Charles Edward has this idea to invite all the British journalists, Danish journalists, all the international press corps to Coburg and wants to entertain them. The journalists, especially the ones from the Daily Mail, are overawed and say this is so terribly impressive. So it's a great success, a great PR campaign.
Hitler realized Charles Edward could help deflect attention from Germany's increasing military strength and aggression. He appointed him president of the newly formed Anglo-German Fellowship to spread the word that Hitler saw Britain as an ally. Charles Edward jumped at the chance. For a man branded a traitor and spurned by the establishment, he could now return to Britain with his head held high, and he owed it all to Hitler.
Charles Edward is the ideal door opener, the ideal icebreaker. To send him over to Britain seems to be the solution for Hitler. He will talk to the Prince of Wales. He will encourage pro-German feeling in Britain. And that's what he uses him for, of course.
With the leader he had supported now in power, a role which took him back to the country he had pined for, and a growing family, his life was full of purpose.
My grandfather was quite a shy man. He was quiet, but he was also funny, serious sometimes. But with us children, he was completely gentle. Mealtimes were really what he needed to have, the same thing what he had in England, which was always porridge and his tea and his toast. And once a week he had this horrible Irish stew, which I still don't like. And his afternoon tea was again his English tea. It had to be at 5 o'clock.
Now overjoyed to be making regular trips to England, Charles Edward felt that in the Prince of Wales he had found a real ally. Both cousins shared an admiration of Hitler, and an optimistic Charles Edward reported back that the future King of England did not want Britain to go to war with Germany.
Charles Edward thinks that he has this great influence on the Prince of Wales, and then meets the Prince of Wales and says, we have to settle this, we have to work out some plan, German-British relations have to improve. And he's really treating him like a small relative, because Karl Edward thinks of himself as the head of the house, and he forgets that the Prince of Wales is, of course, in the hierarchy much higher up than he is.
In 1936, while Charles Edward was on an official visit to England, his first cousin George V died. And it was at the King's funeral that the widening political gulf between Charles Edward and his British family became glaringly obvious.
All of them were in ceremonial uniform with great cocked hats and a great deal of braid and medals, and they all looked fantastic and wonderful. But at the back of the procession was Charles Edward with his metal hat on. And of course, by that time, the poor chap was also suffering from rheumatism and arthritis, so he was rather bent over as well, and he cut a very sorry spectacle at the event. And I think it was rather felt to let the side down.
But of course, what else could he wear? Because after all, George V had removed his garter, had removed his dukedom. By that stage, he was a German, and his British uniforms had been taken away. He had no right to wear them. And so that's why he would have been dressed as he was. He had no alternative.
With the new king on the throne, Charles Edward's optimism and sense of his own importance on the world stage grew.
He was proving back home in Germany that he was an important envoy and could be used as such, because he had the ear of the king.
But his hopes were soon dashed. Just months after he became king, Edward VIII abdicated. And with Charles Edward's only British royal ally gone, he once again found himself ostracised.
After the abdication of Edward VIII, I don't think that there's any evidence that George VI and Queen Elizabeth had any time for him at all.
With no role left in Britain, Charles Edward threw himself into another. Hitler had hijacked the German Red Cross and made him president, and he now became embroiled in the darker side of the Nazi regime.
Now, the German Red Cross was a massive organization, over 400,000 women, about 170,000 men, including 5,000 physicians and doctors. Although Charles Edward was largely a symbolic figure, it was, after all, his organization, and people reported to him, including his deputy, Ernst Robert Grawitz, who was also an SS officer.
All officials and nurses now gave the Nazi salute and wore military-style uniforms. But the organization was hijacked for more sinister deeds.
The doctors were the ones who were implementing the Nazis' racial policy, the so-called euthanasia, the T4 program, where those deemed unworthy of life were murdered in asylums. And the T4 program, between 70,000 and 100,000 people were murdered in Germany. And these physicians, they participated in the cover-up, as they would tell families that their loved ones had died of natural causes or what have you. And they were complicit in these murders. And Charles Edwards, one of his closest associates, Ernst Robert Grawitz, was one of the people who implemented the T4 program. Grawitz was a real killer and was a fanatic.
The barbaric T4 program was an exercise in mass murdering the weak and disabled, including children. More than 100,000 were gassed in an extermination program that was the precursor to the horrors of the camps. As symbolic figurehead of the German Red Cross, Charles Edward's knowledge of T4 is debatable. But Hitler's anti-Semitic policies were becoming more overtly brutal and impossible to ignore. In November 1938, he declared open war on Germany's Jewish population in events known as Kristallnacht.
Coburg, of course, the synagogue was destroyed in Coburg. And so one could have no illusions after that about what kind of regime this was.
Over 3 days, more than 30,000 Jewish men and women were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. Shops and businesses were vandalized while the population stood by. After Kristallnacht, no Jew in Germany was safe.
It was reported all over the world, certainly all over Europe. People couldn't believe that a government could inflict such horror on its own citizens.
Before Kristallnacht, there were 233 Jews in Coburg. By 1942, there were none, and the town was officially declared Jew-free.
I'm sure he knew about it. It's a small town and it can't have escaped him. I think that, of course, Charles Edward was anti-Semitic, and this has something to do with his anti-Bolshevism again, because for him, Bolshevism and Jewishness is more or less the same.
Hitler's real intentions could no longer be ignored. He was terrorizing Jews in Germany, had marched into Austria, and annexed the Sudetenland. At the end of August 1939, he invaded Poland. Days later, Britain declared war.
This country is at war with Germany.
For a second time, Charles Edward faced the agony of being at war with the country of his birth. And this time, there would be no going back. Now the sense of duty instilled since childhood ensured his commitment to the Third Reich was absolute. He was too old and ill to fight, but his 3 sons, Ernst, Hubertus and Leopold, were sent off to war.
During the war, Charles Edward keeps a very low profile. I mean, he's clearly not fit for a military service because of his age and because of his physical condition. Charles Edward has no real power during the Third Reich. He sits in his office in Berlin and is looking for a purpose, but increasingly he's being marginalized by Hitler and the Nazi leaders.
The war brought personal tragedy to Charles Edward. In 1943, his favourite son, Hubertus, was killed in a plane crash on the Eastern Front.
They lost the most wonderful man. He was, first of all, he wasn't married. He was a very good-looking man. Everybody loved him. He was a wonderful brother, a wonderful son. When we saw him, he always brought something and had fun with us. So it was, we all were really devastated.
The Allies were now advancing into Germany. Hitler's days were numbered, and Charles Edward would pay a heavy price for his faithful allegiance to Hitler. The former British prince, who'd been warned by his mother that the worst thing he could do was bring shame on his father's name, had nothing but disgrace awaiting him. As the Second World War ended, Charles Edward was seeing out the dying days in his castle above Coburg, while Hitler had gone to ground in his bunker in Berlin. But just days before committing suicide, Hitler was still looking out for Charles Edward.
Hitler sent a telegram from the bunker saying that Karl Edward shouldn't fall into enemy hands, and this shows a certain affection for the man. He must have valued him and thought of him highly. It is bizarre that Hitler, who, as we all know, didn't have very close relationships with anybody except his dog, was caring for Karl Edward.
But Hitler couldn't save him. American troops were advancing on Coburg, and Charles Edward watched them with his family, including his 10-year-old granddaughter, Victoria.
You could see from the castle, because it stands very high up, Americans were advancing and seeing where the bombardment started. We were all sitting in the cellar. One of the senior Americans came and said they would like to have a word with my grandfather and they'll bring him back later on.
What I think is so striking, though, is the fact that he felt the need to put on a uniform. He was still a prince, he was still a military man. He had this notion of honor and dignity, and all his other uniforms seemed inappropriate. So he put on his hunting association uniform, and he presented himself to the Americans.
My grandmother waited, the dinner or lunch waited, and he didn't turn up. He didn't turn up for 2-3 days. I think it might have been even a week, and she was by that time really worried. We wanted to know where he was. He needed his medicine, he needed his clothes.
The American troops had no idea of the prize they had captured, a senior Nazi who was also related to King George VI.
1,000 men and a jeep, the long, long trail of Germans heading for the barbed wire corral.
Even when the truth was known, he got no special treatment. He was held in the harshest internment camps while he was investigated.
He's in a dreadful situation. He's been imprisoned for ages and he's riddled with arthritis and he's starving and he's not properly housed and his wife's having to walk 3 miles over the field to get to him each day.
Charles Edward couldn't expect any help from his British family, apart from the one person who had always stood by him. Princess Alice and her husband flew to Germany to try to rescue her brother. She was horrified to discover him scavenging on a rubbish dump to find a tin to eat from.
They wined and dined various American generals to try and persuade them to look more favourably and sympathetically at Charles Edward. I think she felt that he was always her brother and that she loved him and that she understood why he'd done the things he'd done.
Princess Alice's pleas fell on deaf ears. When Charles Edward faced his tribunal, he pleaded not guilty. He said that he had acted honourably and had no proof of any crimes of the regime. His wife, Victoria Adelheid, took to the stand to defend him.
She acknowledges that subordinates had come to him and expressed the belief that people were being killed in the euthanasia program. And she said her husband had just dismissed these rumors and couldn't believe them. And she says the same thing applied to the concentration camps. But I do think he had clear knowledge about the crimes of the regime. Perhaps not the gas chambers, but he knew that millions of people were perishing in the East, and despite that, he stuck by Hitler and the regime.
The tribunal found him guilty. Though he was exonerated of having taken part in war crimes, he was judged to have been an important Nazi. His houses and estates were confiscated, and he was almost bankrupted by heavy fines. Only his failing health saved him from a jail sentence. This prince, who all his life had been used to great wealth and luxury, was now a penniless, convicted criminal.
My grandfather, when he came back from prison, he was a very frail and very sick man. And by that time, my grandmother was given a chauffeur's cottage. And he thought it was wonderful. He had everything what he loved. He had his wife, he had pictures, he had his little dog. And it didn't matter how small, it could have been even one room. He would have been happy not to be in prison anymore.
Charles Edward's health was in serious decline. He had cancer, was crippled by arthritis, and was blind in one eye.
I found it just heartbreaking, because it was a stronger person before he left, and then he was completely different. But he was still, he could make a little joke.
He was exiled forever from Britain, but was unable to let go of what might have been. In 1953, he made a last trip from his house to the cinema in Coburg to watch his cousin being crowned Queen Elizabeth II.
The assemblage in one voice cries, "God save the Queen."
I think he would have cried, and seeing all his relation, and especially his sister there, and he would have thought, so sad that I can't be there with them, and it could have been me sitting there too. And it was, for him, I think, must have been the worst time in his life.
The man ordered to leave his home as a 14-year-old boy clung on to the mementos of England he had brought with him. One in particular had special meaning.
He always slept in a particular bed, which was his bed from Claremont. He said it was his little bit of England, as he could never come to England again. This is a one place of England I'm going to die. And he died in that bed.
Charles Edward, former Duke of Coburg, died on the 6th of March, 1954. His sister, Princess Alice, became one of the best-loved members of the royal family. Her final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace was in 1977, almost 90 years to the day when she first stood there with her brother at Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. She died 4 years later. By contrast, the shame of Charles Edward and Coburg are a forgotten footnote in the royal family's history. Despite 4 state visits to Germany and family connections, Coburg remains one town the Queen has never visited.